Welcome, everybody. My name is Elaine Garby. I'm the Senior Associate Director of Elliott School Alumni Programs and a Master's Alumna of the Elliott School as well. We're very excited to welcome you all to another event with our International Women of Elliott Network, featuring one of our Executive Circle members, Brooke Pearson, especially today of all days as we celebrate this year's International Women's Day today. And then, of course, it's Women's History Month. This is also the second event in our series, Meeting the Moment, highlighting alumni who have stepped up to a challenge in their own unique way this past year, and there's certainly been no shortage of them. Brooke is one of a number of alumni we featured in the Elliott School's annual State of the School report this year, and we'll include a link to the report following this event so you can read more about the incredible work of our community this past year. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. Please note that questions are welcome at the end of the discussion, and our speaker will answer as many as time will allow. Simply submit your question into the Q&A box at any time during our discussion, and we will try to get to as many as possible. Please note that only the panelists and I will be able to see the submissions, and the chat function has been disabled. You've probably already noticed that we are also using closed captioning for our virtual events to promote accessibility for all of our audience members. You can hide the captions or subtitles in your individual viewer by clicking the up arrow on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Finally, I want to thank our co-sponsors this afternoon. The Elliott School's Gender Equality Initiative and International Affairs, led by Dr. Shirley Graham. The Young Black Professionals in International Affairs, led by Elliott students Hannah Jackson, Maya Burrell, and Simeon Parker. And the Delta Phi Epsilon Professional Foreign Affairs Sorority, led by Elliott Senior Manoush Mobrahan. We're especially pleased that Manoush is joining us today to moderate the discussion with Brooke. In addition to serving as DPE president, Manoush has worked at the Elliott School's Institute for Middle East Studies for the last 3 years and is currently working on both her international affairs thesis, exploring the impacts of the Sino-Iranian 25-year cooperation agreement, and her economics thesis, where she is analyzing the diversity and inclusion of introductory international affairs syllabi at American universities. She will be one of our first graduates of the Elliott School's new Bachelor of Science program. Very, very impressive. Manoush, I turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elaine. I'm delighted to be participating in this afternoon's event. Turning to Brooke. Brooke Pearson is a technology executive at Google with over dozens of years of senior experience in foreign policy, public diplomacy, and cybersecurity, spanning both the public and private sector. She managed the Fulbright program for Afghanistan and Pakistan and Central Asia for the United States Department of State for 5 years and earned a meritorious honor award for exemplary public service. She transitioned to the technology sector, initially joining Facebook's public policy team as a crisis response program manager and eventually becoming a leading expert in cybersecurity and privacy communications for Facebook, Uber, and now Google. At Google, she manages the Privacy Sandbox program, which proposes a set of privacy-preserving APIs to support business models that fund the open web in the absence of tracking mechanisms like third-party cookies. A vocal diversity advocate, she is a celebrated leader of the Black employee research groups for both companies, strengthening her workplace's recruitment and retention mechanisms. Brooke holds a master's degree in international policy and practice from the Elliott School, a bachelor's degree in communications from Azusa Pacific University, and a certificate in product management from the university. We have a lot of topics to cover, but I want to start with your career and the varied tracks you've taken. So you started out in communications and then got involved in global engagement, taking part in the Fulbright English Teaching Fellowship in Macau. What drew you to international affairs even before you came to the Elliott School?
Thanks, Manoush, and it's a pleasure to join you today, and thanks to Dean Ayers and everyone for inviting me. I'm excited to join as a member of the International Women of Elliott and speak to you, because there's a lot of things I wish I knew back when I was in graduate school at GW. And, you know, when I think back to what drew me to international affairs, I'll actually go all the way back to high school. So I grew up between Washington, D.C. and Louisville, Kentucky. And an opportunity came up to, over spring break, go to Moscow, Russia. And I was 13 years old. And so I told my mom, I was like, Mom, I think I want to go to Russia, which, if you can think about time frame, this is 2001. This is not too many years after the wall has fallen. And my mom no one in my family has ever left the United States. So to leave the United States and not go to somewhere, that they are more familiar with, like a Mexico or a Canada, but Russia was really jarring for them. But they were really supportive. And I was the first Black person that many of the folks in Russia that I got to meet with while I was over there had ever met. Black Americans, that's for sure. And so I kind of got bit by the bug early. I realized through traveling that there was so much more to the world, just culturally speaking, and that it became ingrained to me at a young age. So by the time I got to college, I definitely, I studied abroad at Oxford. I spent a summer teaching English in a refugee camp in Burma, on the border between Burma and Thailand. This people group called the Karen, which have been refugees from the Burmese government for many years. And that's where I realized that I could make a career out of this, out of connecting people across cultures. So you mentioned the Fulbright program, and I know you have some history with that yourself. I did take part in the Fulbright program after I graduated from my undergraduate degree. I taught English at a university in Macau to about 500 very motivated students who were eager to learn English, because the biggest job creation that was going on in Macau was surrounding the casinos that are really active there. And that was the time of my life. It really was. And that's when I started wondering, like, okay, if I were to make a career out of this, what would that look like? So I decided to shadow someone who's become a good friend of mine now, Sarah. Sarah Huck was a consular officer at the US consulate in Hong Kong. But she was first tour. She was young, she was in her 20s. And I said, hey, do you mind if I just follow you around in the consulate one day? I want to see what this work is like. And I got to interact with her. She was public diplomacy coned, which I could already tell was sort of lining up with my interests, as far as, focusing on sharing mutual understanding between cultures. And I was bit. So after that, I applied to the Elliott School and decided to pursue a degree. So it's a bit of a long ramp to get there, but it was clear by the time I was finishing up my Fulbright time in Macau, I knew I wanted to go back to DC and go to GW.
Okay, so from there, you then spent 7 years working with government programs. What did you learn from your time at the State Department, particularly as it relates to you and where you were headed in your career?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. The first thing I learned is that if you graduate into a recession, it can be hard to find a job that pays you. So that was one initial challenge I needed to overcome, was, how to support myself during my graduate degree. And I actually was on the Fulbright Association's alumni website and was just looking at job opportunities that I might be able to do in conjunction while I was pursuing my graduate degree, most of which, as you guys all know, Elliott School classes take place in the evening to facilitate that type of professional development through work. And I saw a job opening for an organization that was a program agency of the State Department, running a program called the IVLP program, the International Visitor Leadership Program. They had a job opening for a program associate, and it was an entry-level opportunity, and they were trying to get alumni of State Department exchanges, of which the Fulbright program is one. And so I filled these boxes despite having no degree in international relations, and actually, trying to approach it from my communications degree. But obviously I had that international experience, which together, along with my commitment and the pursuit of my degree in international affairs at GW, I think maybe the perfect fit for that role. So I started as a program associate supporting the IVLP program, and I did that for several years. And that was actually a really good thing. The pay wasn't great. It was enough to make sure that I had food and internet so that I could do my homework when I got home from a full day of work and class. And while that was really grueling, I think it was great because I got to build some incredible networks with folks at the State Department. And my reputation was building. I became promoted to a junior program officer, so I started overseeing State Department programs on my own, albeit on the nonprofit side. So when an opportunity came along, a contractor headhunter came to me out of the blue and said, "Hey, there's this job at the State Department. I think you'd be a great fit. It's a contractor role. Would you like to apply?" And at this point, I was like, well, I don't know if I'm qualified to be I was like 25. I read the job description and it said senior program officer. And I was like, there's nothing senior about me. Are you sure that this is a good fit for me? And she was like, listen, your experience combined with now your degree is exactly what you need to be qualified for this role. And it was a contractor opportunity, which meant that I would be able to get my security clearance, which was another kind of chicken or egg situation that a lot of people, I'm sure, understand. It's hard to get a job in the government if you don't already have the security clearance. And so becoming a contractor was actually a really good way to get my foot in the door, so to speak. So I joined as a contractor focused on Afghanistan, Fulbright program. So I was the program officer overseeing Afghanistan. And I did that for about 2 years before a full-time employee civil service position opened up. And I was then perfectly eligible for that because I'd already been doing the work. So then I got to become a federal government employee officially. And, it's something that I would like to go back and tell myself if I could, what I learned from that time is go for the opportunities that may not be 100% what you're looking for. Like, I didn't know that I wanted to do Afghanistan. I had no regional background or language ability with Afghanistan, but a lot of, the more senior folks who were in my field didn't want to go to Afghanistan. They had families. They knew that they couldn't bring folks with them, that it was going to be a really grueling and challenging program demanding of, a lot of time. And in my, early to mid 20s, I had nothing but time and, a few attachments. So I was really comfortable traveling. In fact, I loved traveling. So the multiple tours of duty that I did in Afghanistan were a benefit. Like, I loved it. So even though you may be looking for a job that's in a specific agency or a specific place, be open to opportunities that may get you a piece of what you need, because that'll be a step in the journey. That security clearance, that contractor opportunity really set me up for success when it came to joining the State Department.
And I think this is a great place to include that for all the students here who are sort of starting out in their international first career or not sure where to go, Fulbright programs are a great opportunity to take advantage of it.
Yes, indeed.
All right, so switching gears, in an episode of the Security Conversations podcast last summer, you recount the story of how you decided to leave government for Silicon Valley to find a completely new path in cybersecurity. Can you tell us about what made you take such a turn in your career?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And it wasn't entirely on purpose. I'll admit that. So when I was doing work in Afghanistan and also Central Asia for a bit, I had a layover in Doha in Qatar on the way to, I believe it was Uzbekistan. And my layover was just long enough. It was maybe like a 10-hour layover. So just long enough that I had needed to leave the airport and just stretch my legs if I could, and get a real meal where I could sit down and just sort of stretch out after being on those long flights. And so I took a cab over to a hotel that I knew had a good restaurant in there. And I walked in. I thought initially I was the only Black person in the restaurant. And initially I was kind of overwhelmed. There were a lot of men there. I couldn't see other women because many of them were covered. And this was my first time in Qatar. And they seated me at a table in the back right next to another Black female diner who was dining solo. She was a female. I could see that we were, somewhat close in age. And so, I'm looking at the menu and we're both kind of like stealing glances at one another because we both recognize that we're the only two Black women in the room. And so I leaned over and I was like, hey, my name is Brooke. I work for the State Department, would love to chat with you, considering we both are doing dinner alone. We can do dinner together. I wasn't totally inside my comfort zone, but I was a little bit jet lagged and sleep deprived, and it ended up being one of the best decisions I've ever made, because the person who I was talking to, her name is Abele. Abele is the public policy director for Facebook for all of Africa, the entire continent. And I had just read, I think it might have been in The Economist or something, an article at that time, this was back in 2014, Facebook's number one goal, number one, was to bring internet connectivity to the entire world. And to get there, they had proposed this program called internet.org, or Free Basics. I recommend anyone here look it up. It's really interesting. But the goal was to try to bring the internet to, countries in Africa, including India, countries in Africa and India and other parts of South Asia, but through sort of a walled garden. So it would be the Facebook app that people could interact with, but then they could also find job opportunities, public health information, public transit. And, so it was designed to be really utilitarian, which was a good idea in theory, but I had some opinions about it. So I'm talking to Abele and I was like, can I ask you a little bit about this program? I was like, in my experience, in most countries in the world that I've been to, people don't want to have a little bit of the internet. They want access to it all. And the whole idea of open internet and open governance and internet being a right, this kind of flies in the face of that. So I'm just curious. I was asking her, from a public policy standpoint, how are you selling this? How is that working? And she laughed. She was like, yeah, it's not working so well. Ultimately, that was a really doomed project. It had a lot of people who were well motivated to do the right thing. But at the end of the day, people want full access to the internet, and not just through Facebook. But she remembered that conversation, and we kept in touch. I think I added her on Facebook, ironically. And it wasn't until 2016 I was looking at a job opportunity at Facebook on the public policy team, and I was like, I wonder. I think I've had a great time at the State Department. I love my work. When I thought about opportunities to continue to challenge myself and grow and develop subject matter expertise, I realized that I could switch to another role or I could join the Foreign Service, but I didn't really want to do either of those things. And so it became really interesting to me that Facebook's whole point, their whole mission was to bring people together and connect them across cultures, which was really similar to my values and my life goals anyway. So I asked Abele, I was like, what do you think if I applied for this job? Would I be even qualified? I don't have a degree in computer science. And she was like, this job, not this one, but I'm glad you reached out because I have one just for you. And that's how I ended up interviewing for and eventually joining Facebook's social good public policy programs team, which was actually a 100% alignment with my my background. But the job wasn't posted anywhere. But starting that conversation with somebody who already worked there, she was able to help me navigate what would be a good opportunity for me. So the moral of the story here is always be networking.
All right, so at this point in your career, you're fully immersed in cyber, and next Friday, March 19th, you're participating in a social media movement called Share the Mic in Cyber, which is working to amplify the voices of advocates and allies in discussing the racial issues that have dominated the news while showing that representation matters. Can you tell us more about Share the Mic in Cyber and what kind of impact it has had?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like I should also share one other impactful thing that happened. So I joined Facebook in 2016, in July of 2016. So this was shortly before Facebook discovered that we had a data problem via Cambridge Analytica. Some of you may remember there was, basically it came to light that information about users, really highly targeted and sensitive information, was used by an analytics firm under the auspices of Cambridge University with the goal of swaying public opinion. And especially here in the United States during that 2016 election season. So what was a public policy issue became really tricky because once the Trump administration began, I think some people in leadership felt maybe a little hesitant to probe too deep there. But at the end of the day, we had a national security issue via Cambridge Analytica when any entity seeks to sway US public opinion and thereby shift national security, it becomes a big issue, but it's also a cybersecurity issue. So I switched from the public policy team into cybersecurity, once again, having no background in it. I had a background as a program officer, program manager, and I saw that this was at once a geopolitical issue so much as it was also a technical issue. And as a communicator, I was used to briefing executives, like at the State Department. I was used to writing one-pagers. And so they saw my expertise and my ability to speak and advocate and make complicated things simple. And that's how I ended up kind of sliding over into cybersecurity without any background in it. And once I got there, I realized that, especially on the technology side of things, there weren't a whole lot of people of color at Facebook on the security team. And as I started looking around the industry, I started going to conferences, I realized that there's a perception that people in cybersecurity wear hoodies and, are in dark basements coding. That is completely false. And yet a lot of the people who are in top positions in cybersecurity are typically men, and they sometimes wear hoodies, and they may not look like you or I, Manoj. So Share the Mic in Cyber is really important because it was an initiative started by a Google employee, actually, who said, there's so many people who are people of color who are doing good work in cybersecurity. And they're, number one, don't usually get an opportunity to shine because they're not in leadership positions. But also, they become invisible. We become invisible. And the perception that this is a very white male industry is, quite frankly, wrong. And it behooves us to protect our national security by having the most diverse workforce we can. Job opportunities in the cybersecurity industry are expected to increase, I think, something like 5-fold over the next 10 years, which is incredible. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for people with backgrounds like ours in international affairs to get into this field and contribute really meaningfully. And that's become, I think, even more important since the SolarWinds hack that came out last year. These present grave threats to our national security. And so we need a really diverse set of voices at the table. So I joined on, was paired up with an ally on Twitter, and basically took over their Twitter account the last time we did Share the Mic in Cyber, and just shared about myself and my professional contributions. And it was really cool because the person who I was partnered with had thousands of Twitter followers. I don't have too many yet, but if you want to follow me, I'm at Brooke, Lenet. Go ahead and follow me whenever. I'm joking. The goal isn't to get more followers. The goal is to raise the voices of cybersecurity practitioners. So it's really meaningful to me and really excited. This month, we're doing it during Women's History Month. And we're going to be highlighting the voices of women of color and Black women during Share the Mic in Cyber this month. So tune in. We'll be doing it again next Friday.
Yeah, so like you touched upon, overall, foreign policy, tech sectors have traditionally lacked diversity, specifically women and people of color. And Share the Mic in Cyber is one great way that we're working to amplify voices. But what are some ways that you work to address these issues wherever you've been, from the State Department to Facebook to Uber and now at Google?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the issue, and unfortunately this is sort of endemic, right? The underrepresentation of people of color in the technology industry, in the national security industry, the public sector and the private sector, it's endemic. And when I think about the problem, a few things come to mind. Number one, sometimes it's not exactly seen as good for your career to be involved in a employee resource group or an affinity-based group. There's a lot of pressure on people to just deliver on the job as opposed to bringing their full selves to their work. Another issue that I've seen classically is that there are a lot of people of color who have degrees, have experience in the field, but they come into the industry sometimes under-leveled. So where their counterpart, their male or white counterpart, may be at the GS 13 level, they may only be offered a 12 with the same experience. And so there is an issue there from an equality issue, a wage issue, and frankly, a career visibility issue. So community and professional development are two areas where I've seen people be held back in their careers, people of color. And that's where I decided to lean in and use my voice, because my time at Facebook wasn't all roses. It was actually very challenging. And there were a lot of times where my intelligence was called into question, or when I was tokenized and asked to be the diverse opinion in the room. But, didn't get the credit when I made a good call, but definitely got the blame if my call wasn't the best. So that, ability to make mistakes, it's harder for women and people of color. It's a little bit easier to get painted with a broad brush if we make mistakes. And so that causes the imposter syndrome that's always there to worsen. And it can be really damaging to your psyche if you allow that pressure to get in your head. So I became very vocal and a leader within our employee resource groups at Facebook, Uber, and now Google, and lead by example and a little bit with humility to say, hey, I've struggled with imposter syndrome my whole career. And I've gotten bad performance reviews from where I didn't deserve it. And I've been talked to in ways that weren't respectful. And you're not alone if you're experiencing that. And I think that community building, along with pressuring our companies to do better when it comes to equal pay for equal work, you have to do them in tandem, right? Because for one, you're trying to retain the talent that you have. And for the other, you're trying to recruit additional talent. But people aren't going to want to come in the door unless they see there's an opportunity to learn and grow and be themselves. So that's been my tack. I mean, it's once again, it amounts to basically an extracurricular activity in addition to killing it on my day job, but one that's really meaningful for me because I want to open the door wider for folks to come behind me so that it's hopefully not as challenging for them.
Yeah, like you said, having a diverse workplace is absolutely necessary and impacts the work you do so much. How do you see that this lack of diversity has affected our society and our government?
Oh, I think we see it in a few different ways. Let me see if I can find a good example. So at one point when I was at Facebook, there was I was in charge of this product called Safety Check. And Safety Check, for those of you, there's probably some young folks here on this call who don't even use Facebook. So let me describe what that is. But Safety Check is a tool. Let's say that there is a hurricane or an earthquake, so a natural disaster, or a human violence event. So God forbid if there was a school shooting or a terrorist attack. Facebook created a tool back in around 2014 or so that allowed you to mark yourself as safe from that event. And it would tell your whole network. This was really helpful if you're in a place where your phone is going down and you can't call and text your family to let them know you're okay. But instead of sending a group email out to everyone, you can just say, hey, I'm okay from this event. Great tool. But it wasn't always built with the most cultural awareness in mind. So an example, Facebook turned on Safety Check after a terrible terrorist attack in Paris. But a week later, there was a terrorist attack in Beirut, Lebanon, and Facebook did not turn on Safety Check. And that's where they realized that they had a diversity problem, because immediately folks in Lebanon were going, well, where's our Safety Check? There's just as many Facebook users in Lebanon as there are in France. And so we were exhibiting through our products a Western bias. And Facebook was really slow to recognize, though, that that was actually a problem. So by the time that I joined the team, they had made it so that the community, so people in society, could turn on the tool themselves, which was better, right? So that people could say, okay, well, I'm in Lebanon, this is important to me. There's a Safety Check incident, this explosion or whatever. But the problem is that the terminology that people use wasn't always right. So when I was on the team at Facebook, on the public policy team, there was a peaceful protest over the killing of an unarmed Black man in Charlotte. And some people in the community were referring to that peaceful protest as a riot. Now that we all know that that's usually a racially charged term because riot is often applied to people of color when they're protesting for their rights. And protest is associated typically with, with white protests. And at the time, the protest was completely peaceful, but safety checks started turning itself on and trending as a riot in this very African-American community in the Carolinas, and it was really problematic. And so I called it out. I said, hey, we can't let this trend as riot. It's a protest. And I got some pushback from leadership. They were like, is this a problem? It'll be a really bad user experience if we change the name of it halfway through after, thousands of people have already experienced it. And I was like, user experience aside, this is going to be really bad for Facebook's brand if we're the ones who term this a riot before anyone else does. And that's not what it is. People are going to potentially be hurt by this. And my leadership gave me a lot of pushback on that. They were like, okay, this decision is going to be on you. And I was like, yes, let's change it from riot to protest. I believe this is the right call. No headlines. There were no headlines about that for good reason, because we did the right thing. And I caught a lot of flack for it, unfortunately, and I didn't get the credit for saving the company's reputation in that regard. But I shouldn't have had to be the only person in the room to see that that's a problem. And that is where diversity, lack of diversity, affects our society and our government, because what may seem innocuous to one person or a series of people who come from the same culture could be really damaging to another community. So it behooves us, if we truly want to build representative products, if we want to build a representative society, to have representative leadership at the table.
Yeah, that was a great example. There are things that we don't even consider when you're not coming from a certain background, that it's literally impossible to get that unless those voices are present.
Exactly.
Finally, last question before we turn to audience questions, we have to ask, what advice can you give, particularly the students and young alumni participating, ways that they can get involved in security and privacy? And secondly, what advice can you give to students who want to address equity and inclusion on all levels? And perhaps what skills can aid them in their careers incorporating these ideals of equity and inclusion?
That's a lot of things, and I do have some thoughts. Luckily, I wrote down some thoughts. So first off, I want to say, if you are, in this call right now and you have a degree in international affairs and it's not in security studies, don't think that that's prohibitive from you being able to get into a field like security or privacy, because the field is so new and growing that, quite frankly, when I was an undergraduate, these were different fields entirely. So it is all about what you can learn on the job. I think the best way to find a job in tech is to make sure that your LinkedIn's up to date. That's going to be really important, because your LinkedIn is your digital resume as far as technology is concerned. Make sure that your brand, whatever it is that you do, you wear that well, wear it on your LinkedIn, wear it on your Twitter, reinforce it in your social media. That's important. But the other thing is that networking is super important, even in this digital age. I tend to be very involved with a couple of Slack channels that are for security and privacy professionals. Typically, if we were going to conferences, I would be there, just going around and meeting people, because just like in DC, sometimes it's hard to get a job in DC unless you're in DC, and luckily all the GW students are in DC. And a lot of that networking takes place at happy hours, at think tank lectures. The same is true for the technology industry. If you can find your way to some of the big security conferences like DEF CON or Black Hat, that's where the recruiters for a lot of companies like Facebook and Uber and Google, they pay a lot of money to sponsor those events so that they can find talent that is in those fields. So this is an interest of yours, go expose yourself, learn, join these communities, because that's the best way to get a foot in the door. To your question though, Manoush, about advice I can give to students who want to address equity and inclusion on all levels. I think that this is a strategy that I've used over my career. If you're really passionate about equity and inclusion, and you're also really passionate about Sino-Iranian issues. You don't have to choose. A lot of folks will want to make you say, okay, well, you can either be an expert in your field or you can be a diversity advocate. And if you're a diversity advocate, they're more likely to say you should go work as a diversity inclusion officer, which that's a complete misnomer in my book. You can advocate for diversity no matter what your position is. And sometimes you need to be strategic about it. So don't support every cause. Don't go to every meeting or whatever. Focus on the ones that are going to be most impactful for you, that you feel like you can bring the most of yourself to. Commit to those 2 or 3 things. Don't overcommit. And then save time to deliver professionally in an area where they can start to see that not only are you a diversity advocate, but you're also the best in the industry. And those 2 things don't have, if you become the living example of those things, then it will become more popular, frankly, to be an advocate for diversity inclusion while being at the top of your professional game. And lastly, your question, because it was a 3-part question.
Yep.
What skills can aid people in their careers that incorporate ideals of equity and inclusion? The single most important class I took in all of my studies to date is a class offered at GW called Negotiation Skills. It's a 1-credit skills class. And that class taught me so much about how to operate in a setting where there are conflicting interests. So typically if someone says like, you know, the sweater has to be yellow, and someone else on the other team says, well, we believe the sweater has to be green. It seems like an intractable conflict at first, but that class taught me to peel back the layers and ask the question, well, why does the sweater have to be yellow? Typically, if you ask that question, someone will say something like, because it makes the person look good, or it goes well with the contrast in the video. And then the other person will say, well, it has to be green because it's the color of, you know, this country's favorite, the flag or something. And so once you tease apart those interests behind those positions, that's where you can start to find areas for compromise and for mutual understanding. And that understanding how to do that has served me so well in the public sector and the private sector, because oftentimes intractable conflicts, there's not that many of them in actuality, especially once you start breaking them down and teasing it apart. So if I could go back and take another class again, I'd probably take the negotiation skills class again.
That's great advice. Thank you so much, Brooke. So we will now turn it over to audience questions. We have about 20 minutes remaining. So you can submit your questions using the Q&A function, like we said at the beginning. You can submit anonymously, you can submit with your name, and I will read the questions to Brooke. We have a couple questions, but before we start on those, we have a comment from Dean Ayers. She wanted to say that it was great to hear about your path to international affairs and your moves across different sectors. Your experience shows exactly how an international affairs education prepares people for all kinds of challenges. Love to see it. Thank you for your great work, your engagement with the Elliott School, and congratulations on your accomplishments, which will inspire many.
Thank you, Dean Ayers.
So let's turn to a question from Haley. She asks, how can you make your resume stand out when you're applying to a big tech firm?
This is a great question, and something that I wish I'd known. Actually, I think, Manoush, we were talking about this the other day. I have 2 or 3 versions of my resume. The first version of my resume was my government resume. So that one was basically almost a curriculum vitae. It was exhaustive. It included my theses from my thesis papers that I wrote, every internship I'd ever had, every certification I'd ever had, where I studied abroad. Like, my government resume was pretty long. I think it was 2, maybe 3 pages. And that's actually really good if you're applying for a job on USA Jobs, where you need to be able to document how you fulfill a number of key requirements. That's one way to make sure that you're equipped for that industry and those types of jobs. But if you're interested in moving into tech, here's something I had to learn the hard way. They won't read a resume that's longer than a page. Full stop. So if you're someone who has had a decorated past with lots of awards, et cetera, Those things can't go on your one pager. You need to treat your one page resume like it is a briefing document that you want to hand to the president. Like, it needs to be short and sweet and to the point. It needs to tell your story succinctly. And it needs to fit the jargon of the industry. So for instance, I was a program officer with the State Department. So in government circles, international development firms, contractor firms, federal government positions, program officer, people understood exactly what that job meant. But when I got to tech, I realized that the equivalent job description was program manager. It was almost the exact same competency as program officers. It's just that in the tech industry, we call it program management. And what a simple change I could make. I literally just did a find and replace on my resume and switched out where I'd said officer to manager. And then I started getting a lot more attention from recruiters. So pay attention to the nomenclature that people use in the technology sector when it comes to looking at job descriptions. The other thing is that tech resumes are typically a little bit more focused on succinctness. So what'd you do and what was the impact? Instead of focusing on all of the responsibilities that you had for that role, just focus on what did you do? What was the impact? And that feels like you're leaving a lot of things out. It's true. That's why LinkedIn is your best friend, because that's where you can be a little bit more exhaustive if you would like, because people can just scroll and it's still one page.
Here's a question from an anonymous source. Do you think you would come back to the government at some point in your career?
Ooh. Yes, I actually want to come back to the government. The reason that I joined public service first is because that's where I truly saw the best alignment with my values and my career goals. And that hasn't changed. Frankly, I think that sometimes our government struggles when it comes to relating to big tech firms, Facebook, Google. And our government has a responsibility to help protect everyday citizens from threats to their safety and their privacy. And I think our government is building more expertise in fields like security and privacy, but doesn't really have a robust engagement model with tech outside of the lobbying industry. And that's starting to change. Like, I know there was some incredible cooperation between tech and the government when it came to ensuring that this last election in 2020 was free and fair. But there's still a lot more work to be done. So I would love to see myself returning to government at some point and hopefully being able to serve in that capacity as a truly a liaison or a translator between public sector and private sector. So there's a lot of smart, really passionate people in Silicon Valley who want to make the world a better place. They're just not always as culturally dexterous as those of us who have backgrounds in international affairs. So there's a lot to learn. If you find yourself wanting to pick a sector, either public or private, here's my suggestion: don't pick, do both, because I've learned so much from both, and definitely look forward to returning to the government at some point in the future.
All right, another anonymous question. If someone is interested in pursuing a position in security within the tech industry, is it better to come in with a security policy experience? And if so, why? Other than a tech experience?
I would say it depends. So I have a friend who was on Facebook's election security team who had a background in Chinese as her language and had a degree in security policies, in this case from Georgetown. In trying to get an analyst position, that experience was perfect. Having that security policy degree was really, really clutch. But that's not for everyone. So it sort of depends, right? Like, if you are a security engineer, a cybersecurity engineer, I have several colleagues at Facebook and Google who don't have a degree at all. They don't have a bachelor's degree. They do not have a master's degree. They don't have a certificate, associate's degree. They just learned to code. So I think that's why the field is so relatively diverse when it comes to people's experiences, because you have people like me who come in from a communications or public policy background. Some people come from a consulting background, product operations, product management. The field is really, really wide and really diverse. You don't have to be a coder with a hoodie on, and you also don't have to be an analyst that can speak, Farsi and Korean. Although there's definitely a whole path for people who do have experience in critical language when it comes to the intersection between cybersecurity and national security. So for those positions, absolutely, it's nice to have a security policy degree, but don't count yourself out, especially if you have really good professional experience. That almost counts for more. So if you spent time in one of these regions and say you have a deep understanding of the needs, and then you have a kind of generalist public policy background, certainly put your name in the hat, because that experience is going to stand out probably from other candidates.
Another question. Any tips on best approaches to discussing sensitive diversity-related subjects in a multicultural group? Any thoughts from your work in the big tech field?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yes, there's a couple things I would, if I could go back and tell myself, I would. Some small mistakes that I made. And there weren't mistakes per se, but just learning how to navigate. Sometimes, if your boss, for instance, and this has happened to me, I had a colleague at Facebook who he was relatively new. He was his first 6 months, and he was really passionate about diversity and inclusion. But in his boss's mind, he hadn't proven himself in his job enough to be able to carve out that time in his workday to do diversity and inclusion events, Black Employee Resource Group events. And so his boss saw him emailing to wide distro lists within Facebook, come to this event that we're doing to highlight Black art, come to this event that we're doing to highlight, intercultural voices of, and his boss basically said to him, hey, I appreciate that you're interested in that, but you haven't delivered enough wins in your day job. And I see you doing all this other stuff, which seems like it's a distraction from what we hired you to do. And that was really, really hard for him, because this was something that he was super passionate about, and he thought he was killing it on both fronts. But his boss saw that he was being really vocal about his diversity and inclusion work, and he was really downtrodden. He was like, Brooke, I don't know what to do. Like, should I not be as vocal about my work? And I was like, no. Here's what I learned. You should learn to share the credit a little bit. So I was like, how about we worked on this event together? This time, I'll send the email out. Next time, you send the email out. So we'll trade off so that we each have maybe only one big win on the diversity side each quarter, but we're still involved. It just becomes obvious that we share the credit. It's team credit. That way, if anyone has any questions about how we spend our time, we just kind of appear to step back for a little bit and just let the other person step forward. And so that's what a lot of Black employees at Facebook end up doing, unfortunately, is learning to create a network of people who say, okay, I asked a really tough question during the last all hands of Mark Zuckerberg. Maybe next time you can ask the tough question so that I don't get a reputation for being a rabble rouser. And it sucks. It shouldn't have to be that way. But that is the best way I've learned to navigate, is through finding community and learning to lean on one another when it comes to pressing the company to do better.
Yeah, definitely. I'm learning so much. I don't know if other people are on the same page, but I'm frantically taking notes throughout this whole thing because these are all great tips.
Well, yeah, I wish I could, like I said, I wish I could go back and tell myself. I probably would have saved myself a little headache here or there.
All right, another question. Elliott and GW have been working on the same goals as many other industries to increase diversity and representation on boards. Can you talk about why it's important to have that representation at the top for people looking at the path from the beginning of their academic or professional journey?
That's a great question. I remember my first job out of college, the organization that I mentioned that worked on the IVLP program. I met with the board, and I remember thinking, oh, it's a lot of men in suits in that room. I wonder what meeting that is. And came to find out it was the board. It was a steering body for the entire company. And I remember asking, like, hey, can I join? Can I sit in? Like, because there were some people who had, ambassador in their former title. And just from a networking standpoint, I was like, I want to learn from these people. Maybe I have a mentor in that room. Um, a lot of times people of color will find themselves, especially young ones, shut out of that room. If you're in the room, it's because you're delivering water or cookies or something. and that's a shame, because it sends a message that I don't belong in that room when I absolutely do. So it is critical to have board leadership that is diverse. I'll give you another example. Uber, I think this is all pretty well documented. There's an excellent book called Super Pumped that I recommend anyone read when you learn about, how toxic masculinity can really endanger the growth of a really exceptional company. And that's, I think, what unfortunately was the early story of Uber. But the board had some gender diversity on it. Ariana Huffington was on there, but it didn't have a lot of ethnic diversity. And the company realized that was a problem as the company started to go in the literal skids. The IPO was going to be delayed. Uber had issues with government and public policy circles for programs that had gone afoul of local governments when it came to unmarked cabs, that sort of thing. And what was a really good idea was going off the rails. And they invited in Eric Holder, who's our former attorney general, to do a report on Uber's culture. And Eric Holder, if you haven't ever listened to him, he is brilliant. And he was attorney general under Barack Obama. He came in with a report called the Holder Report. I think it should be required reading for anyone who wants to do diversity and inclusion work in tech, where he outlined all of the problems with the culture that were creating a culture of toxic masculinity within the company. And he was like, here's what you should do. You should refrain from having your meetings at strip clubs. Sounds like a really simple idea, right? But actually telling people and putting on paper, don't do this. This creates a toxic work culture. Don't have hard liquor in your office. This creates a toxic work culture and the possibility for harassment to happen. These recommendations he put out there, and everyone listened because of his stature, because of his background. The whole company started modeling the transition of its culture after this recommendation from someone who didn't yet sit on their board. And that's when they realized that they needed more diversity on their board. It can be make or break for a company. A board is designed to help a company shift and see around corners. Reputationally, what's the problem? What is going to keep us from realizing the full potential of this company? And that's where you need diverse voices. You need it at the employee level, but you certainly need it at the board level. And it's one of the reasons why I'm really excited to be in the International Women of Elliott, because it's an incredibly diverse group of women. And I'm excited that GW recognizes the need, truly, and the power in diverse female leadership.
I'd like to ask one final question, and this one's coming from me. This series is titled Meeting the Moment. So I think it'd be remiss if we failed to mention two things of the moment. One is obviously the coronavirus pandemic that's forced everyone to work from home. And second being the events of last summer with the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many more. Looking forward, how do you see these two things changing the culture of the tech industry, of the public sector moving forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, here we are. This is Women's History Month. This is International Women's Day. But it's also, for many of us, the 1-year anniversary of when we started sheltering in place. This horrible pandemic has changed a lot of the way we work. And some of that has been, I think, in a positive way, and some of it has been super challenging. It's been a super challenging year, I know, for many of us on the mental health front. And I think we need to admit that that's been a challenge. One positive that I see coming out of this, I had the chance to participate in a peaceful protest here in Oakland, California, where I live, after the killing of George Floyd. And, the thing that drew us down there is that the week before, the local police had issued a curfew for the city of Oakland. And there was already a pre-planned parade, not a parade, a street protest, peaceful, from Oakland Tech High School proceeding down Broadway into downtown. And the curfew was supposed to start at 7 p.m. But around 6 something, the police started shooting tear gas canisters at high school students who were peacefully protesting the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others. And that was really a moment for many of us who, you know, we were scared to leave our homes because the threat of the pandemic was that bad. And we were scared to leave our homes because there was a curfew and we didn't know how violently the police would put down even a peaceful protest if it was in violation of this curfew. Those were really hard times. And yet me and several of my friends were like, if they're going to fire tear gas at children, then maybe we as adults are the ones that need to be out there. And so we masked up, you know, we took all the proper precautions that we could. We even brought our bicycles to create a little more space around us, and so that we could get out quickly if we needed to, unfortunately. And that was a moment. We just peacefully sat in an intersection at night in Oakland as there were like helicopters going overhead. And our country is recognizing, I think, that we need to do better. We need to be better. And we're not going to accept platitudes anymore. Those empty statements of, you know, oh, we regret and feel so badly about X and we commit to doing better with Y. I can tell you firsthand that inside companies like Facebook and Uber and Google, that's not flying anymore. People are saying, you can keep your good wishes and bad feelings, and we want to see how you are going to economically commit to improving the lives of these communities who've been marginalized in large part by you and your products. And employees are saying that internally. We're getting pressure externally. So I think the chance for people to get away with just feeling bad about the state of the world has passed. It's time for us to be a lot more active, and these companies are recognizing it. We're seeing some really cool initiatives. Like I know for one, Google is highlighting Black-owned businesses outside of the month of February. I'm like, it's March and we're still talking about highlighting Black-owned businesses. That is wonderful. So that's the change I think that we're going to see. We're not going to relegate ourselves to celebrating our diversity and the richness of our cultures and what we bring to the table as an American society just within the month of February or March. We're going to take over the whole year. And I'm going to hope to be a part of that momentum because there's still a lot more work to be done.
Thank you. Me too. Brooke, thank you so much again for joining us. Elaine, off to you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much to both of you. I, for one, am, just from what you were saying just now, Brooke, very, you know, amidst all the hardship and turmoil this past year in particular, but just in general, right, that I'm also very hopeful and excited about the progress and change that we can participate in and hope for a better world. So thank you so much for all that you have done to help us on that journey. And we are very, very excited and glad that you are part of our International Women of Elliott. And thank you again, Manoush, too, for doing this expert interview. We hope to see you as part of the International Women of Elliott after you graduate. We just have a very busy and exciting schedule of events coming up this spring. And so just wanted to highlight a couple of them, and then we will put them in the thank you email to everybody as well. But the next big event for us at the Elliott School is March 25th. As part of GW's bicentennial celebration, we will have a signature event for the Elliott School that features all of our former deans and including our current dean, Dean Alyssa Ayers. And that will be moderated by Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, who's also the vice chair of our International Women of Elliott and is an undergraduate alumna of the Elliott School. So please join us for that discussion. And then I'll just highlight one last thing for International Women of Elliott. I just today have confirmed that we will be able to welcome Carol Spahn, who is the acting director of the Peace Corps. This will be in late April, April 28th. She's also an Elliott School alumnus. So we're very pleased that our alumni are doing great things in many different sectors and that we can highlight them for these virtual events. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing everybody in future events. We look forward to seeing Brooke and Manoush at IWE events coming up. Please, everyone, stay safe, have a good afternoon and evening, and enjoy the week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, Manoush.